Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're jumping into a really fascinating academic framework. It explores a wild idea. What if a major crisis could actually be used to reshape societies in the Gulf, to transform citizens from, passive recipients of state support into active participants in their nation's very survival? All right, so here's our game plan. We're going to start with the stable ground before the earthquake hits. Then we'll get into the psychology of what a major shock does to people. From there, we'll unpack this idea of intentionally guiding a society through the chaos. And crucially, we'll end with a pretty big word of caution. And this quote right here, it sets the whole scene. The paper asks us to imagine it's 2026. A conflict erupts, and that long-held belief of the Gulf as this untouchable haven of stability, it's just shattered. And this isn't just a physical threat. It's a deep psychological crisis that forces everyone to rethink everything. So to really get the impact of a crisis like that, you first have to understand the foundation it's shaking. What was the deal, the social contract in the Gulf before all hell broke loose? Well, the paper uses this key concept, the rentier state. For decades, the deal was pretty simple. The state gets huge revenues from oil and gas, and in return, citizens get generous benefits, subsidies, and government jobs. It's often called the rentier bargain. You could say it's wealth in exchange for political calm. And this is the direct result of that bargain. The paper argues that this system created what's called a rentier mentality. Basically, a culture where you kind of expect the state to take care of things. The citizen's role becomes more passive, more about receiving support, than, say, taking on entrepreneurial risk. And boom. That's the system that gets a direct hit. The paper estimates that a war lasting just 3 months could cause GDPs in the region to plummet by 10 to 15%. I mean, that is a staggering amount. This isn't just an economic dip. It's a body blow that threatens the entire rentier bargain we just talked about. Okay, so this system is cracking. The stakes are incredibly high. So what happens inside our heads? How does a crisis of this scale affect the human brain and how we make decisions? This is where the paper dives into some really cool behavioral economics. Turns out our brains get totally rewired under extreme threat. We become what they call loss averse, meaning a loss hurts way more than an equivalent gain feels good. So we freeze up, we hoard cash, we see empty shelves, and our fear of scarcity kicks in, leading to panic buying. And under all that stress, we stop making calm, rational choices and fall back on gut reactions and old habits. It's all predictable, totally human stuff. But here's the thing, we aren't just a bunch of individuals freaking out on our own. The paper argues that our group identities, who we feel we belong to, are an incredibly powerful force in a crisis. It completely shapes how we deal with that fear. And in the Gulf, identities are complex, right? They're layered. You might see yourself as, say, a proud Emirati, but also as part of the bigger Khaleesi or Gulf community. And on top of that, your religious or tribal identity might be super important too. All these layers exist at the same time, and they're all crucial to understanding what happens next. And this leads to a really interesting finding in the research. That broader, shared Khaleesi identity can actually act as a kind of psychological buffer. It's a source of resilience that can protect people's well-being, even, and this is the fascinating part, even when the conflict involves other Gulf states. That shared identity is powerful. So if you understand all these psychological triggers and social bonds, the paper asks a really provocative question. Could you actually intentionally guide a society through a crisis toward a better, more resilient future? Could you engineer active citizens? And this right here is the core idea, this massive proposed transformation. The goal would be to shift the entire role of the citizen. You'd go from being a passive consumer of state benefits and security to an active co-creator of national survival. Someone who contributes, who participates in their own defense, who embraces new economic roles. It's a huge shift. So how would you even do that? Well, the paper lays out a potential 3-step playbook for this social reframing. First, a massive messaging campaign to redefine what being a good citizen even means, from getting benefits to actively contributing. Second, you'd use the crisis as political cover to push through tough but necessary economic reforms. And third, you'd actively promote new social norms where self-reliance and community contribution are the new cool. But okay, that all sounds very high level. How would you actually do it on the ground? Let's look at the specific tools the author suggests. This is where the whole framework gets super practical, pulling a lot of ideas from behavioral nudge theory. And some of these examples are just brilliant. So to fight panic buying, you don't just tell people, don't panic. That never works. Instead, you show them TV footage of fully stocked warehouses. You reduce the feeling of scarcity. To fight that passive mentality, you create tons of highly visible, easy-to-join volunteer groups. You make being an active citizen a tangible, normal, and celebrated thing to do. Now, the paper also makes a critical point here. These nudges and messages can't just come from the top down, from the government. For them to really work, they need to be channeled through organizations that people already know and trust. Community groups, religious leaders, local charities. These groups act as force multipliers, making the message authentic. But let's be real, this whole idea of social engineering, it's an incredibly powerful tool. And as the author is very quick to warn, it is absolutely a double-edged sword. It comes with enormous, enormous risks. And that's it, isn't it? The paper asks the single most important question you can ask about a plan this ambitious. What happens if this deliberate attempt to reshape an entire society's mindset completely backfires? And the risks are just huge. If people feel like they're being manipulated instead of motivated, all trust is gone. If the messaging is tone-deaf and feels like the government is betraying that old social contract, people could reject it completely. Instead of creating a more resilient, engaged society, you could end up with more fear, more anxiety, and a country that's just stuck in survival mode. And so, in the end, the paper leaves us with this really provocative question. It gives us a framework, a potential blueprint for how a society might be guided through chaos. But it definitely doesn't offer any easy answers. It forces us to ask, is it really possible to architect a better, more resilient society out of the trauma of war? Or are the risks of even trying just way too great?